Chapter 3. Slavery and the South. In 1929, when Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta, Georgia, most black people in America lived in the South. In fact, 9 out of every 10 African Americans lived in the South. In every way, their lives were worse than the lives of Southern whites. They were poorer, they lived in worse houses, their lives were shorter. Most blacks in the South could not vote. Some black people who were alive in 1929 had been slaves. They had belonged to their white owners, and they were treated like things, not people. White people could buy and sell slaves just like houses or land. In the past, many countries have used slaves. Hundreds of years ago, there were slaves in Rome and Athens. They worked on farms and in the houses of rich people. But they were not slaves forever. After some years, they became free men and women again. But in North and South America, slavery was different. In the 16th century, people from European countries like Britain, Spain, and Portugal began to move into North and South America. They cut down forests and cleared the land for farms. They needed men and women to work on their farms. Where could they find them? The answer was Africa. Men and women were taken from their homes in Africa and brought to North and South America to work on farms and on roads. From about 1500 to 1850, European ships took at least 10 million men and women from Africa to become slaves in the Americas. The ships were very full, and the men and women did not have enough food, water, or air. Hundreds of thousands of Africans never reached America. They died on these slave ships. When African slaves arrived in America, they were sold to white farmers. Often, people from the same family were sold to different owners and never saw each other again. Husbands lost their wives, and children were taken away from their mothers. In the South of the United States, the farms were very big. The farmers usually grew sugar or cotton, and they needed slaves to do the hard work in the fields. The white farmers gave the slaves food, clothes, and houses, but the slaves had to stay on the farm. They belonged to the farmer. When slaves ran away, they were usually caught and brought back to their owners. Then they were beaten, and sometimes even killed. Many slaves fought against the slave owners. In 1791, a black slave called Toussaint Louverture led an army of slaves against French soldiers on the island of Haiti. Toussaint died in a French prison, but in 1804, Haiti became the first free black country. In Virginia, in 1831, a slave called Nat Turner led slaves against their white owners. They did not succeed, and Turner himself was killed. But the slave owners were afraid that one day the slaves would win the fight. Some black leaders wanted to return to Africa. In 1822, a new country was born in West Africa. This was Liberia, a country for people who were once slaves but were now free. 100 years later, African-American leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, argued for a return to Africa. After 1808, it was against the law to bring slaves from Africa to the United States. But the number of slaves in the South continued to grow. By 1860, there were more than 4 million slaves in the South. They were no longer Africans, but African Americans, and they wanted to be free. When Americans wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, they said that men and women should be free and equal. But the men who wrote the Declaration owned slaves. How is this possible? This was a difficult question. By the 19th century, many black people had become Christians. They went to church on Sunday, just like their white owners. Blacks and whites both read the Bible, and the message of the Bible was the same. All men and women, black or white, are equal in God's eyes. More and more people in Europe and America thought that slavery was wrong. Britain ended the buying and selling of slaves in 1807. A year later, America did the same. Many northern states ended slavery, and they wanted it to stop all over the United States. But southern slave owners wanted to keep their slaves. They refused to free them, and they were ready to fight for their right to own slaves. The southern states were ready to go to war for these rights.